Okay, so this is my presentation on globalisation, and the question asked is, what effect does globalisation have on public spending, and how does this effect manifest itself on the public services and emergency services? My name's James Oliver Beckett Dunn, and I've optimised this video hopefully for me to be able to upload it to YouTube. Okay, so let's begin with a brief overview of globalisation. According to Merriam-Webster's dictionary, globalisation is to make something worldwide in scope or application. Put simply, globalisation is the process needed to enable the financial and investment markets to operate on an international level. This comes mostly as a result of advanced and improved global communications. Okay, so globalisation came to be seen as more than simply a way of doing business or running financial markets. It became a process. This is a quote from a recognised writer on globalisation, Mr. Simon Jeffrey. Okay, so globalisation is a phenomena that took the world by storm. Recent discussion within sociological and political science has been careful to distinguish globalisation as theory from theory of modernisation. The concept of globalisation should not act simply as a synonym for a new phase of modernisation or for westernisation. At the same time, globalisation theorists have tried to avoid explanations that could be considered as reductionist or determinist, i.e., something that appears to reduce the aspects of complex process or a societal subsystem like the economy. This is an abbreviation of an extract from a book called The Limits of Globalisation by Alan Scott, and describes a more academic impression of globalisation. The best way to consider how this reflects on the world of globalisation is to view it as a thought that globalisation is just a name for a process society already experiences, and that we should not divert ourselves from the process that already exists. So let's move on to history. History, for example, signs of the effects of globalisation from the past. Centuries ago, trade was a fundamental part of life, from the very bottom end of the social economic spectrum right to the top, with kings and queens looking to persuade and bargain with other countries for new materials or allies in war, to the common man looking to trade farmed items for food and stock. A history of trade shows signs of today's globalisation effects, and yet back then this process was not called globalisation. The requirements for this trade to work meant that industrial manufacturing and even the beginnings of globalisation, even in the form of trade ship from Greece, Spain or other countries carrying goods or items to be used for trade. So if we move on now to the next slide. So where does globalisation come into play regarding the emergency services of today? This presentation will focus on the effects of globalisation and the effects that globalisation has had on the police service, and whether it will continue to affect it. Globalisation and the illegal drugs trade. Now, the globalisation of the drug trade, deregulated and privatised markets have allowed the drug industry to spread its activities worldwide, opening new trafficking routes and production zones and infiltrating the legal economy to a degree that decision makers cannot ignore. Similar to the car manufacturing, pharmaceuticals or banking industries, the illegal drugs trade has become a globalised industry. I mean, this information was sourced from an article called Social Sciences from the UNESCO website. Quick interesting fact about globalisation and the drugs trade. The international drugs trade is worth an estimated £200 billion a year. This is an astronomical figure, with only the international arms trade boasting a higher turnover. So if we move on to some facts then. So the facts. The illegal drugs trade is said to generate an estimated £8.5 billion a year in the UK alone. It is also said that approximately 56% of all organised crime, that's every type of organised crime, including money laundering and people trafficking, it's said that approximately 56% of organised crimes are related to the illegal drugs trade. This is a huge increase in the earlier signs of organised crime. So it's on the rise. It's on the upcoming. Okay, so the illegal drugs trade has a huge amount of capital, expertise, manpower, influence, and power, and obviously means of transportation. This will have a direct impact on the individual countries such as the UK. The illegal drugs trade has a huge amount of funding that can be sourced from the sale of drugs and other things surrounding it. So money laundering, importing and exporting, transportation, even property buying from money generated from the sale of drugs. And this funding comes from an almost inexhaustible source, as the drugs can continually be manufactured. Even when a lab or a crop site, etc., are brought to a halt by the police, another one is quickly opened and the trade continues. So the source of funding is completely inexhaustible. So we move on to the next slide. The police. So in order to tackle these advantages the drugs trade have, the police must counter it with their own influences. A couple of images here sourced from the Google website of some of the facilities that are in place, the huge fleet that's been put into place by the police, and raid groups and raid teams from the Metropolitan Police, from the other surrounding counties police. So what have they done to counter these effects? Well, numerous operations have been set out to tackle drug importing through the Customs and Excise Division. A vast fleet of police vehicles have been put into operation with advanced technology to keep up with the ever faster and more expensive drug runners, dealers, vehicles, and so on. More and more dog units are being trained and dispatched to be used for sniffing out the drugs and chasing down street dealers, etc. The list of different departments, equipment and personnel needed is growing rapidly, along with the huge expense it costs to put these in action. So if we move on then to how does this affect public spending? Now, the fundamental part of government funding for the public services come from the taxation of the people. So really a clear and obvious path to a rise in taxes is becoming clear as crime, more specifically the drugs trade, grows. Okay, so not only does the increase in taxes affect the people, but it affects the economy at a significant level also. This is clear in many countries in economical decline, as it is very clear in many of those countries that surrounding the drugs trafficking trade comes the two extremes of economical balance. The one being the very wealthy, higher level of criminal, and the other the extreme poverty of those not involved, even those involved in the drugs trade but on the using side as opposed to the selling and the dealing side. The one thing we do see is in some cases the citizens of these countries have taken to migrate to countries in a better economical state, such as the UK, in order for them to send finances back home to their families, etc., and obviously for a better way of living. This too affects the UK economy, as huge amounts of minimum wage work is taken from the many of the UK citizens, and so increasing unemployment is coming into play, and this is forcing people to have less or no salary, and thus forcing income tax to an all-time low. This is a huge issue, so we have to address this as part of the public spending and the effects of globalisation on that. So with income tax being so badly affected, where is all the funding coming from to pay for our police force to operate effectively and reduce these crimes? It's this writer's belief that, however unfortunate it may be, we are in a spiralling decline of our own capabilities to tackle such a powerful globalised industry as the drugs trade, and that this globalised industry does clearly affect the public by ways of the economic downfall and the lack of funding to inject into tax paying. So, in conclusion then, if we look at a couple of the facts that this presentation has brought forward, the presentation has given a brief overview of globalisation. It has evaluated the effect this has had on globalised crime, and it has highlighted the UK's ability to pay for globalisation and the effect it has on public spending. So I'd like to take this opportunity to thank you for checking out my presentation, and I hope it's been some sort of assistance in getting an idea of what globalisation is and how it, obviously in the most minimal sense of the words, how it's affected the police service in the UK. And we've specified with the drugs trafficking trades because obviously statistics are available and that it's probably one of the most common factors in crime fighting that there is today. So if we move on to a few references, and thank you very much for your time.